It began like any other Lagos morning. The city was quiet by its own standards. Traffic still thin, radios murmuring from open windows, the air holding that brief calm before Lagos became Lagos. Inside a modest home, a man sat down to breakfast. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. Nothing hinted that history was about to fracture. Then the morning was ripped apart. The sound was not just loud, it was brutal. A sharp, unnatural blast tore through the neighborhood, rattling windows and shuddering walls. For a heartbeat, the city froze, suspended in disbelief. Then came the sirens, urgent, overlapping, frantic, slicing through the silence as neighbors ran into the streets, drawn not by curiosity, but by fear. This was no accident. This was no random tragedy. This was deliberate. Before the news could travel, the shock already had. Phones rang unanswered. Newsrooms fell into stunned silence. Journalists stared at one another, struggling to process what they already sensed was unthinkable. A man had opened a letter, an ordinary envelope, the kind delivered every day, and it had exploded in his hands. In an instant, the boundary between the routine and the unimaginable collapsed. Questions spread faster than facts. Who would do this? And more chilling, why kill in this way? Not with a gun in the shadows. Not in a car chase or a dark alley. But in broad daylight, inside a private home, using a method designed not just to kill, but to terrify. By midday, the truth could no longer be avoided. This was not simply a murder. It was a message. A warning folded into paper, sealed with violence, and delivered with precision. And then came the deeper fear, the kind that lingers long after sirens fade. Because if this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone who asked the wrong questions. Nearly 4 decades later, the debris is gone. The neighborhood has moved on. The sirens are silent. But the explosion still echoes. Who killed Dele Giwa? And why has no one ever been held accountable? To understand the murder, you have to understand the man. Dele Giwa was not merely a journalist. He was a threat. As co-founder and editor-in-chief of Newswatch magazine, Giwa helped reshape investigative journalism in Nigeria during a time when truth itself was considered dangerous. Newswatch did not deal in whispers or propaganda. It published what it could prove, especially the things powerful people preferred buried. Giwa was disciplined, methodical, and relentless. He was obsessive about facts, unforgiving about verification, and unwilling to trade safety for silence. In an era when intimidation was usually enough to make journalists fall in line, Giwa refused to bargain. He did not negotiate with power. He documented it. What set him apart was not bravado, but precision. He didn't shout accusations. He assembled evidence. He traced relationships, followed money, mapped decision-making, and exposed how authority actually functioned behind closed doors. His reporting didn't just embarrass individuals. It revealed systems. That made him dangerous. In military-ruled Nigeria, criticism could be dismissed. Protest could be crushed. But exposure, careful, documented, undeniable exposure, was intolerable. The state could survive outrage. It could not survive records. Dele Giwa kept records. He remembered details. He connected dots others desperately wanted scattered. To those in power, he was not a noisy dissenter. He was worse. He was a quiet archivist of secrets. And in a system built on silence, a man who knows too much becomes expendable. Dele Giwa was not killed because he was brave. He was killed because he was precise. Because he exposed how power worked, and who benefited from it. And for that, someone decided he had to be silenced. Not quietly, but loudly enough for everyone else to hear. To understand why Dele Giwa was killed, you have to understand the country he worked in, and the rules that governed it. Nigeria in the 1980s was not simply under military rule. It was under military discipline. Power did not come from public consent or debate. It came from decrees, from uniforms, from obedience enforced by silence. Information was not a civic right. It was a controlled asset. And those who mishandled it paid the price. Decisions were made behind closed doors and announced without explanation. There were no press briefings meant to clarify, only statements meant to end discussion. Questioning authority was not considered journalism or civic engagement. It was treated as defiance. And defiance did not last long. Critics disappeared into detention. Publications were seized overnight. Editors were summoned for questioning sessions that had no paperwork, no lawyers, and no timelines. The message was rarely spoken aloud, but everyone understood it. Talk too much, and consequences would follow. The press survived in a tense, unstable standoff with the state. Newspapers and magazines operated within invisible boundaries, red lines that shifted without warning. A story that passed today could provoke a raid tomorrow. Editors learned to read not just facts, but moods. Survival depended on intuition as much as integrity. Journalists were watched. Phones were tapped. Homes were monitored. Careers were quietly dismantled. Some reporters were jailed without trial. Others were pressured into exile or silence. Violence didn't have to be constant to be effective. Fear was built into the system itself, reinforced by examples and sustained by uncertainty. Everyone knew someone who had crossed the line. In this Nigeria, silence was rewarded. Courage was punished. And survival often meant knowing what not to publish. The killing of Dele Giwa did not erupt from chaos. It emerged from order, an order designed to suppress accountability and protect secrets. His death was extreme, but the logic behind it was familiar. This was not an isolated crime. It was the loudest expression of a system that had long normalized silence. By the time Dele Giwa was killed, he was no longer chasing dramatic headlines. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was following patterns. At Newswatch, Giwa's work had moved beyond individual scandals to something deeper, an examination of how power actually functioned. His reporting focused on institutions, not personalities. On processes, not rumors. On the machinery behind decisions, not just their outcomes. The investigations underway at the time were sensitive precisely because they did not accuse specific individuals. They questioned systems. They examined how security agencies operated beyond public oversight, how influence flowed behind closed doors, how accountability was absorbed internally and never allowed to surface publicly. These were not stories about isolated wrongdoing. They were about structures that depended on darkness to survive. What made Giwa's work particularly unsettling was how he built it. Not on whispers alone, but on documents, timelines, corroborated sources, cross-checked facts. His reporting left little room for dismissal. Once published, the stories became records, and records are dangerous in authoritarian systems. Military power thrives on ambiguity, on uncertainty, on information moving downward, never outward. Giwa's work reversed that flow. He made internal processes visible. And visibility destabilizes authority built on secrecy. Timing mattered. These investigations coincided with a period of heightened sensitivity within government circles about legitimacy and control. Military regimes depend on narrative discipline, the appearance of order, decisiveness, and unity. Investigative journalism that exposed contradictions between rhetoric and reality threatened that illusion. Then there was Giwa himself. He was not an anonymous reporter. He was a prominent editor. His work reached beyond Nigeria, to diplomats, foreign correspondents, and international audiences. Stories published under his leadership did not stay contained. They traveled. And once they traveled, they could not be quietly buried. There is no need to name specific targets to understand the fear his work generated. What alarmed those in power was not a single article. It was direction, trajectory, momentum. Dele Giwa was assembling a body of work that pointed toward deeper questions. Power without oversight. Security without accountability. Governance without transparency. In that environment, the danger was not what had already been published. It was what he was clearly going to uncover next. Political violence was not new. Nigeria in the 1980s had lived through assassinations, coups, midnight arrests, and unexplained detentions. Death, brutal as it was, followed familiar patterns. Guns. Cells. Silence. But this was different. A letter bomb had never been used against a journalist in Nigeria. It was an escalation, deliberate, calculated, and theatrical. The method itself carried meaning. This was not violence meant to disappear quietly. It was violence designed to be remembered. A letter is harmless by nature. It belongs to routine, correspondence, information, connection. By turning something so ordinary into a weapon, the killer collapsed the boundary between safety and danger. Threat no longer lived only in barracks or interrogation rooms. It could arrive at your doorstep. It could sit on your table. It could wait patiently for you to open it. There was no confrontation, no warning, no visible attacker. Just certainty that the victim would do the most human thing possible: open his mail. This was precision without presence, violence without a face, responsibility without fingerprints. And in doing so, the act rendered protection meaningless. If a journalist could be killed in his own home, in front of family, through a routine act, then no amount of caution could guarantee safety. There was nowhere to hide. Silence no longer promised survival. The letter bomb did more than kill Dele Giwa. It rewrote the rules. It announced that private spaces were no longer sacred. That fear would no longer be confined to newsrooms or police stations. That terror could follow journalists home and sit quietly among their papers. This was not a crime meant to eliminate one man. It was meant to discipline a profession. The true target was not Dele Giwa alone. It was every journalist who would ever open an envelope again. This was not just murder. It was psychological warfare. In the hours after the explosion, Nigeria convulsed in shock. News traveled faster than confirmation. Crowds gathered. Voices rose in disbelief and rage. The brutality of the method alone sparked outrage. This was not a familiar killing. It felt like a boundary had been crossed, one that could not be uncrossed. Citizens demanded answers. How could this happen? Who would do this? Newspapers tried to report while grieving one of their own. Radio stations repeated fragments of information, each replay deepening the horror. The country buzzed with questions, none of them answered. Inside newsrooms, the mood shifted quickly. Anger gave way to fear. So the story ends where it began. Not with certainty, but with a reckoning. What does it mean for a country when telling the truth costs your life, and no one is punished? That question still lingers. And until it is answered, the silence remains complicit.